I once believed graduation day would be the happiest moment of my life. But right there on stage, in front of hundreds, my mother stood up and shouted that I was a fraud, that I had lived off her money. The hall fell silent, every eye fixed on me. That should have been the day I stepped into a new future. Instead, it became my deepest humiliation. What I didn't know was that very moment would ignite another journey, a journey to uncover the truth, to confront the one who had destroyed me, and ultimately to reclaim both justice and freedom. Chapter 1. The graduation shattered. I still remember vividly the way my heart raced as I stepped onto the stage at my graduation ceremony. After 4 grueling years juggling 2 part-time jobs, suffocating under debts, and countless sleepless nights, I finally held in my hands the diploma I had longed for. That should have been the happiest day of my life. The day I could prove to everyone that I could live without relying on my mother, that I could step into the light on my own. But with just one scream, everything fell apart. I had barely taken a few steps when in the solemn hall my mother suddenly sprang to her feet. Her voice rang out, tearing through the echoes of applause still rolling in the room. She cheated her way through college. She's a fraud. Every gaze instantly turned to me. Whispers ignited like fire, spreading through dry grass. Cameras' phones all pointed straight at me. My hands shook so violently, I thought the diploma might slip out of them. Even the principal, who had just extended his hand in congratulation, froze, suspicion flickering in his eyes. It felt as if the ground beneath me had just split open. But my mother did not stop. She pushed forward a few steps, her voice sharper, shriller. I know exactly how she deceived everyone. I once gave her money for books I saw her crying and begging. She has never been independent a single day in her life. Don't let her fool you. The hall turned to stone. My friends looked lost. Professors shook their heads, and I just stood there, stripped bare before a crowd. I could hear my own heartbeat, the sound of a child crying at the back of the auditorium, and the hurried footsteps of security rushing in. Every word out of her mouth stabbed me in the back. Not because I believed it, but because I knew everyone else was listening. In a split second, I saw again the face of my 18-year-old self, the girl who packed her things into garbage bags and left home in the dead of night after my mother cut off support after hearing her cruel words that I would never succeed. That night, I swore I would never look back, and now beneath all those piercing stares, I knew I could not let her steal this victory from me. I drew a deep breath. My knees threatened to buckle, but I held myself upright, and I kept walking. I did not look at her, did not listen to the venom dripping from her tongue. I had long since learned to silence that voice. I reached out, took the diploma from the principal. He looked at me with warmth in his eyes and whispered, "Congratulations, Sarah." In that instant, shame began to transform into something else. Not anger, not despair. It was clarity. I realized my mother had chosen the perfect moment to humiliate me, to crush me at the height of triumph. But she had forgotten I was no longer the trembling child in that cold kitchen years ago. I had survived without her. I had built my life from the wreckage, and I would not let her destroy it. As I left the stage, my mother's voice still echoed a grotesque symphony without end. She screamed that I had cheated, that I had begged for grades, that I was unworthy. But I did not stop. I descended the steps with my back straight, eyes fixed on the exit ahead. Each step was a declaration I was different, now strong enough to stand my ground. In the hallway where other families embraced, laughed, and posed for photos, I stood still for a moment. I longed for a family like that. But all I had was the constant vibration of my phone messages from friends, professors, acquaintances, all asking if I was okay. Words of encouragement mixed with doubt, and I knew if I did nothing, those seeds of doubt would take root. I found an empty room, sat down clutching the diploma in my sweaty hands. But for the first time in years, I was not afraid. I saw the truth clearly. My mother had no power left, except the shame she tried to impose on me. And she had just made a grave mistake, turning a family drama into a public spectacle before hundreds of witnesses, before professors, even before the principal himself. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, then stood up. My graduation day was ruined, but something greater had just begun. I decided I would meet the principal right after the ceremony, not only to defend my name, but to begin the path of bringing the truth to light. And in that moment, I knew my life was about to change course forever. Chapter 2. Flashbacks and the beginning of doubts. When I walked out of the auditorium that day, the weight of humiliation still pressed heavily on my chest. But at the same time, a persistent thought echoed in my mind. There was no way my mother could have known those things, unless she herself was the one who caused them. The words she screamed, she begged for money to buy books, she's never been independent. A single day might have sounded like random insults, but I knew behind them lay twisted fragments of truth. I remembered that spring day last year when I went to the bank to withdraw the tuition support left for me by my grandfather. I had stood confidently at the counter smiling until the clerk hesitated at her screen and said, "I'm sorry, but your tuition account has no funds left. It's actually in the negative." I froze on the spot. My grandfather had left over $60,000, enough for me to complete college without worry. For the first 2 years, I had withdrawn cautiously, always checking carefully. It couldn't have been used up so quickly. But the transaction history appeared before my eyes, large, regular withdrawals, all into unfamiliar accounts. I remember the twisting knot in my stomach. How had the money vanished without my knowing? Who could have touched that account besides me? And then, one thought flashed my mother. The one who always told me I didn't know how to manage money. The one who had held all the family's banking documents. The one who could easily impersonate me because she was my mother. But at the time I had no proof, only a vague, gnawing fear. And instead of collapsing, I did the only thing I knew. I worked more. I took the morning shift at the campus bookstore, then ran to the library for the evening shift. I babysat on weekends. I lived on instant noodles, bought torn secondhand textbooks, and still forced myself to keep my grades up. I thought I had won that as long as I persevered, I could make it. Until one day I overheard my mother's voice on the phone dripping with mockery. Still working those miserable part-time jobs. Such a waste. If you'd chosen accounting like I told you, you wouldn't be in this mess. Studying psychology will only leave you starving. I bit my lip and said nothing. I didn't know that while I was exhausted from juggling 2-3 jobs, she was draining the tuition fund to buy luxury handbags, book spa appointments, even short vacations. That cycle dragged on until one cold night in my rented room, a thought struck me. I couldn't keep enduring like this. I needed the truth. I needed someone to help me uncover it. And so I found Frank Morrison, a former financial crimes investigator, now running a small office above a pharmacy. The first time I met him, I was so nervous I couldn't string a sentence together. But Frank simply listened, his calloused hands resting neatly on the desk, his eyes patient. "You want to know where the money went, don't you?" he asked. I nodded. "Then I'll find out for you. But prepare yourself. The truth may hurt more than you expect." He wasn't wrong. Just 2 weeks later, Frank called me back to his office. On the desk lay a thick folder filled with bank statements, photocopies of withdrawal slips, even handwriting samples. And I recognized with a chill running down my spine the all too familiar script. My mother had practiced forging my signature hundreds of times to near perfection. Frank tapped lightly on a page. "Here transfers into an account in the Cayman Islands, the same period you reported missing tuition. That very month, her credit card records show extravagant spending." I could only sit there in shock. Every suspicion I had was now undeniable truth. The woman who had forced me to believe she sacrificed for the family had in fact stolen my future. When I left Frank's office that day, I walked like a sleepwalker, but I also knew there was no turning back. My mother had turned my graduation into a stage of public humiliation. She had planted seeds of doubt in everyone's mind. If I stayed silent, her lies would become truth in their eyes. I had to do something I had never done before, confront her. And this time I wouldn't be alone. I had the truth, I had the evidence, and I would turn them into weapons. Chapter 3. Investigation and Horrifying Discoveries. I thought I was ready to face the truth, but what Frank Morrison uncovered was more terrifying than my worst nightmares. That afternoon, I sat in the small office, the sharp scent of disinfectant wafting up from the pharmacy downstairs. Frank placed a thick file in front of me, each page feeling as heavy as lead. He began explaining, his voice calm, but cutting Sarah, your mother, didn't just take money once or twice. This was a systematic scheme stretching over at least 2 years. My hands trembled as I flipped through page after page. The bank statements were clear withdrawals of $10,000, $15,000 made regularly, all funneled directly into an account under a strange name opened at a bank in the Cayman Islands. Frank tapped the bottom corner of the paper. This is irrefutable evidence. No one else could have done this because the authorization signature is yours, or at least a nearly perfect forgery. I stared at the shaky handwriting on the page. It was my name, but stiff, unnatural. Then Frank pulled out a small notebook. Inside were hundreds of repetitions of the name Sarah Anderson, written over and over again in different loops, hooks and strokes. A chill crept down my spine. While I had been exhausting myself with part-time jobs, my mother had been somewhere practicing my signature like a criminal, rehearsing her con. But worse still, Frank had traced the parallel spending. Receipts from luxury handbag stores, upscale spas, even plane tickets. All matched perfectly with the times I'd been grinding through night shifts. The same month I lived on instant noodles to afford torn secondhand textbooks, she spent $3,000 on a vacation. That very month, I remembered vividly she had called me and sneered that I was a worthless failure who didn't know how to save. I clutched my head, choking back sobs, while Frank continued, "Do you think she'll stop? No. People like her only stop when they're forced to pay the price. And I believe you're ready for that." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, but Frank wasn't finished. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small USB drive. Inside are recordings you need to hear. I know it won't be easy listening to a loved one like this, but they'll be invaluable evidence. That night, in my cold, rented room, I opened my laptop, plugged in the USB, and pressed play. A voice all too familiar echoed out, icy and dripping with contempt. "You'll never succeed without me. You're just a cowardly child, always needing me to clean up your mess." Then came her laughter, sharp slicing like a knife. Tears streamed down my face as I sat, frozen, caught between fury and numbness. I had once believed she was the only person I could lean on, but now I saw that even when she pretended to care, she was only searching for ways to break me. In another recording, her voice whispered over the phone, "Don't worry, she'll never know about the money. The account is still in her name, but I control everything. She thinks she's independent, but she's still in the palm of my hand." I slammed the laptop shut. The room was pitch black, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The world felt like it was spinning. But instead of collapsing for the first time, I felt a surge of strength rising from within. My mother might have stolen my money, stolen my graduation day, but she had just revealed her fatal flaw, arrogance. She believed she was untouchable, that I would always remain weak and afraid. She was wrong. I began to plan. I saved every file, backed up the USB, and sent a copy to a secret email account only I knew. I photographed every page, stored it on an external drive. Nothing would ever vanish into silence again. In the days that followed, I kept my outward composure, still attending classes, still smiling with friends, but inside every step I took was different. I had weapons now. I had the truth. And for the first time in my life, I could imagine my mother standing in court, listening as a judge read aloud every crime she had committed. I knew the battle would be long and grueling. But when I remembered her standing in that auditorium, stealing my triumph and turning it into shame, I also knew I would never back down. She had chosen to make my victory into a public humiliation. So I would choose to drag her truth into the light before even more witnesses, before justice itself. And I swore this would not just be the story of a daughter betrayed. This would be the story of how I reclaim my honor, every stolen dollar, and my future. Chapter 4, Allies and Witnesses Emerge. After securing the first pieces of evidence, I knew I could not fight this battle alone. If it came down to just my word against my mother's, she would twist her stories, smooth her lies, and once again paint me as the deceiver. I needed witnesses, people willing to speak the truth. The first person who came to mind was Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister. She lived in Chicago and rarely returned home. I called her, my voice trembling. The moment I mentioned the missing scholarship fund, she fell silent for a long while, then sighed. Sarah. Maybe it's time you knew the truth. She told me that years ago, when my grandmother passed away, she had left money for both me and my younger brother Tommy. It was meant solely for our education, over $50,000 each. But Aunt Linda explained that my mother had convinced her to sign papers, transferring the money into her care, claiming it would avoid tax complications. From then on, the funds vanished. Linda confessed I stayed silent because I didn't want to cause a family rift, but I've regretted it ever since. At those words, it felt as if my blood was boiling. Not only had my grandfather's fund for me been stolen, but even my grandmother's final gift had been taken as well. My mother had not only robbed money, she had stolen the love and sacrifice of generations meant for me. I hung up, tears streaming uncontrollably. Yet beneath the grief, I felt less alone. Aunt Linda had confirmed what I had long suspected, and this time she promised to stand by me, even to testify if needed. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbor. Her gentle voice carried through the line, "Sarah, I know it may not be my place, but I've often seen your mother going to the bank on days when you said you were at work. I also saw her showing off new designer handbags, while everyone knew you were scraping by with part-time jobs." Mrs. Henderson went further one evening. When my mother was drunk, she had blurted out, "That little girl will never know how much I've taken from her fund." I sat frozen. All the pieces began to fit together, forming a whole picture. My mother hadn't been hiding in the shadows. She had acted in broad daylight, confident that my voice would never be strong enough to challenge hers. And then came the most surprising of all my brother Tommy. Truthfully, I had feared he would side with her. He had always been the favored child, always believing our mother sacrificed everything for the family. But when I met him at the small apartment he shared with his girlfriend, his face went pale as he looked at the documents I laid out. "This can't be true. Mom said your tuition money ran out because you wasted it. She told me you partied, that you didn't care about school." I pointed to the statements to the forged signatures. "Look, Tommy. While I was juggling 2-3 jobs to pay for textbooks, Mom was draining the fund for vacations. Your fund has been steadily disappearing, too, since you were 16. Tommy's hands gripped his head, his eyes brimming with tears, the first time I had ever seen his disillusionment. After a long silence, he exhaled, "Sarah, if you need me, I'll stand with you. I can't believe it, but I won't let her keep lying." That moment was both painful and relieving. I never wanted my brother to bear such a bitter truth, but I knew that if both of us stood together, she would have no way out. In the days that followed, I worked like a relentless bee, collecting every piece of evidence, every testimony. From Aunt Linda, from Mrs. Henderson, from Tommy. Each recollection, each detail, each fragment, when pieced together, they became a solid wall of truth. I looked at the growing file and felt a new strength stir within me. My mother had spent years convincing me I was weak, dependent, incapable. But now I had the truth. I had allies, and for the first time I was certain she would not escape. She had chosen to turn my graduation into a public humiliation, so I would choose to make the courtroom the stage where her truth would be laid bare. And this time, everyone would witness it. Chapter 5, Preliminary Hearing and Forensic Audit. The first day in court came faster than I expected. I remember that morning vividly. The sky was gray, the autumn wind biting cold. I sat in the back seat of attorney Margaret Chen's car, clutching a file so thick it felt like it weighed a dozen kilos. Inside was everything I had gathered: bank statements, the forged signature notebook, Aunt Linda's testimony, Mrs. Henderson's account, and even Tommy's agreement to testify. Margaret glanced at me in the rearview mirror, her voice steady. Today isn't the final decision, but it's an important first step. You've done very well. As I entered the courtroom, I caught sight of my mother across the aisle. She wore a dark blue dress, her hair pinned neatly, her face perfectly made up. To anyone looking in from outside, she hardly seemed like someone accused of stealing her own daughter's money. Beside her sat a tall male attorney, whispering constantly in her ear. My mother's confidence remained intact. She even threw me a look of pure disdain. For a brief moment, fear pricked at me. But then I remembered Tommy's devastated face when he learned the truth, Aunt Linda's choked voice, when she confessed, and my own years of struggle to reach this day. I inhaled deeply and straightened my back. Judge Reeves entered, a silver-haired woman with stern eyes. Everyone stood. When she sat, the room fell into a silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. Margaret began, "Your Honor, we charge Mrs. Anderson with forging signatures, embezzling educational funds, and misappropriating over $63,000 from her daughter's account. We have comprehensive evidence banking records, forensic handwriting analysis, and supporting witness statements." The opposing attorney rose immediately, his booming voice full of confidence. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than an exaggerated family dispute. My client, Mrs. Anderson, managed her daughter's finances because the young woman was too inexperienced. All funds were used for family purposes. This is not fraud, it is a simple misunderstanding." At those words, my blood boiled. Inexperienced, I had worked 2-3 jobs just to support myself, while my mother bought luxury bags with my money, but I bit my lip and stayed silent. Margaret had told me, "Let the evidence speak," and the evidence spoke. Margaret laid out the bank statements, highlighting every withdrawal, every date aligned with lavish spending. She held up the notebook filled with practice signatures, the pages smeared with ink where my name had been written again and again. The courtroom stirred. I caught the faint flicker of panic cross my mother's face, though she quickly masked it with her usual false composure. Judge Reeves fixed her gaze on my mother and asked Mrs. Anderson, "Did you have any legal authority to withdraw funds from an account under your daughter's name when she had reached the age of 18? My mother hesitated, then answered stiffly, "I did it to protect her interests. She doesn't know how to manage money. I'm her mother. It's my responsibility." The judge frowned. "That is not an answer to my question. I asked, did you have legal authority, yes or no?" The entire courtroom held its breath. I watched my mother's hands tighten until her knuckles turned white. She had no answer. Judge Reeves nodded, jotting down notes. Given the serious and systematic nature of these transactions, the court orders a full forensic audit of all related accounts. We will reconvene in 30 days with detailed results. I exhaled, trembling but relieved. This was not the final victory, but it was a major step forward. It was no longer just my word against hers. The court itself had decreed that every transaction, every trace would be dragged into the light. As I left the courtroom, I glanced back at my mother. She slumped in her chair, her face pale lips, moving frantically at her attorney. And in that moment, I realized for the first time in her life, she was no longer in control. I stepped outside the midday sun, blinding my eyes. A fierce sense of conviction rose within me. The battle had only begun, but the scales of justice were already tilting in my favor, and I swore I would see this through to the very end. Chapter 6. Private Confrontation and Breakdown. Only a few days after the preliminary hearing, I began to notice small changes around me. Neighbors, who once praised my mother, now looked at her differently. Aunt Linda called to tell me that my mother had started phoning all the relatives, spinning stories that I had betrayed her, that I was greedy for money. But this time, not many believed her anymore. She was losing the facade she had used to shield herself for years. Then, one afternoon, while I was in my tiny apartment, grading papers for my tutoring class, a loud, frantic knock rattled my door. I opened it and froze. My mother stood there. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, stripped of the polished, powerful veneer I had always known. The moment she saw me, she started screaming, "Sarah, you have to stop this right now. You're destroying this family. You're making me a laughingstock in this whole town. You owe me that much." I stood in the doorway, my heart racing, but my voice came out calm, almost unnervingly steady. "Owe you. You took my education fund, Grandma's inheritance meant for me and Tommy. You turned my graduation day into hell. What exactly do I still owe you?" She slammed her hand against the doorframe, tears streaming down her face. "I sacrificed everything for you. I kept the money to protect you. You're ungrateful. All you want is revenge." The same old words, the tired refrain she had repeated since I was a child. But this time, they no longer made me tremble. I looked her squarely in the eyes and said, "Sacrifice is not theft. Protection is not forging signatures and sending money offshore. You call it love, but it was only control." She staggered, then collapsed onto the steps outside my door. Neighbors began peeking out. I heard Mrs. Peterson call from across the street. "Sarah, do you want me to call the police?" I shook my head. I didn't need the police. I needed my mother to face the truth. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing so hard her cries echoed down the street. "You'll ruin me. You'll make me lose everything." "What kind of daughter does this to her mother?" I replied softly, my voice cold but resolute. "I'm not ruining you. You destroyed yourself. I'm only bringing the truth into the light." In that moment, I no longer saw the manipulative, domineering woman who had once made me cower. She was just a small, desperate woman, crushed beneath her own greed and lies. She sat there for a long time, crying until there were no tears left. Then, slowly Rose turned and walked away. I watched her faltering figure fade at the end of the street, an emptiness swelling in my chest. I knew from that moment on the bond between us, as mother and daughter, was broken. There would be no turning back. And I also understood then that the coming courtroom battle was not just about reclaiming money or honor. It would be the final chapter of all the years I had been shackled by her control. Chapter 7. The Final Trial, Justice Unveiled. 6 months after the day my mother wept on my doorstep, the morning of reckoning finally arrived. I remember clearly the October chill seeping through my thin coat as I climbed the stone steps of the courthouse. I carried everything with me, the evidence, the memories, and the scars no one could see. The courtroom was packed. Behind me, Tommy sat tightly holding his girlfriend's hand. Aunt Linda had traveled from Chicago, her face tense but resolute. Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbor, wore a beige sweater, her sharp eyes silently saying, "Today I'll tell it all." Even Mrs. Morris, my grandmother's old neighbor, appeared leaning on her cane, but walking in slowly, unwilling to miss this moment. Across the room, my mother sat in silence. No designer dresses, no string of pearls. Just a plain black dress, her hair loose, her face gaunt. Months of waiting, of watching investigators pry through every account, had stripped away the false aura she once wore. Yet even in weakness, her eyes still glimmered with defiance. I knew she was hoping for one last trick. Judge Reeves took her seat, her commanding voice filling the room. "We now begin the final trial of Anderson versus Anderson. The court has received the full forensic audit results and sworn witness statements. Plaintiff's counsel, you may proceed." Margaret rose her words, slicing clean through the fog of lies. "Your Honor, this is no longer a mere family dispute. This is a case of systematic financial fraud. The defendant, Mrs. Anderson, forged her daughter's signature to embezzle over $63,000 from her education fund, while concealing an additional $70,000 inheritance left by the grandmother. We have forged signature samples, bank records, and corroborating witness testimony." At her signal handwriting expert, Dr. Hammond took the stand. she displayed in large signature boards, one authentic, one forged. Pointing to each shaky line, each hesitant pause, she explained, "This is evidence of repeated practice." I also examined the notebook where the defendant wrote Sarah hundreds of times. "This is deliberate forgery." The room fell silent. I glanced at my mother. For the first time, her composure cracked. Her hands trembled, her eyes locked on the papers as if sheer willpower could erase them. Next, Margaret called Mrs. Henderson. The neighbor's voice was steady, firm. I saw Mrs. Anderson entering the bank many times while Sarah was at work. I also heard her boast that her daughter would never discover the withdrawals. "I swear this under oath." Then Aunt Linda. Her voice wavered, but Carrie, to resolve grandmother, left money for Sarah and Tommy. "But my sister deceived me into signing it over so she could take it. I stayed silent for years, and I regret it. Today I reveal everything." Finally, Tommy stood. My brother looked straight at our mother, his voice unsteady but determined. "Mom told me Sarah wasted money, that she didn't deserve it. But these documents show she lied. She even took my share. Because I believed her, I gave up my dream of studying mechanical engineering and went to work early. Today I want the truth acknowledged." In that instant, I saw my mother's eyes quiver with turmoil. She turned toward Tommy, her lips trembling as if to call his name, but he stared firmly ahead. And I knew in that moment she had lost the child she had once counted on as her loyal supporter. Her lawyer rose, trying to salvage what was left. "Your Honor, my client acted only out of protection. All funds were invested, and Sarah was never truly deprived." But Judge Reeves raised her hand, cutting him off. "Are you saying a student working 3 jobs just to buy textbooks was not deprived? Are you saying forging signatures and opening offshore accounts was an act of protection?" Her words were sharp as a blade. The room fell into utter silence. Then the judge began to read the verdict. Each word struck like a hammer against my mother's crumbling wall of deceit. "Mrs. Anderson, this court finds you guilty of signature forgery, embezzlement of educational funds, and misappropriation of inheritance totaling $130,400. Including fines and damages, the amount to be repaid is $300,000, $1,000. Furthermore, this case will be referred to the prosecutor's office for consideration of criminal charges of fraud and forgery." The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. I closed my eyes, exhaling deeply. Behind me, hands squeezed my shoulders, Aunt Linda sobbed openly, and Tommy clasped my hand tightly. I turned to look at my mother. She collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Her cries no longer carried authority, no longer served as a weapon of manipulation. They were merely the desperate sobs of someone finally unmasked. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, what washed over me was relief. Relief that the truth had finally prevailed. Relief that I no longer bore this secret burden alone. Relief that for the first time in my life, justice was on my side. As I walked out of the courthouse, the autumn sunlight bathed my face. I heard a reporter ask Sarah, "Do you feel vindicated?" I only smiled faintly and answered silently within myself, "No, not vindicated. I feel free." Chapter 8. Consequences and My Mother's Collapse. After the final trial, everything happened so quickly I could barely catch my breath. My mother's accounts were frozen to enforce the judgment. The house she once proudly flaunted to neighbors was sealed off awaiting auction. The luxury handbags, the expensive jewelry, all of it was appraised for sale. She had lived off a glamorous image for years, and now those very objects became evidence of her deception stripped away to repay what she had stolen. News spread rapidly through town. The woman who once sat on the hospital board, who had presided over charity fundraisers, was now shunned. I heard that she stopped going to the badminton club, stopped attending tea gatherings because every time she entered a room, whispers rose behind her back. Tommy, though heartbroken, stopped answering her calls as often. He had tried to keep contact, but every conversation turned into reproach and lament. One night, he texted me, "Sarah, I can't take it anymore. I need distance. Mom never admits her fault. She only knows how to blame." I knew sending that message must have hurt him deeply, but it was a step he needed to take for his own freedom. As for me, I still felt the glances of pity and curiosity from neighbors whenever I passed the grocery store or the cafe. But this time, I did not lower my head. They had seen the truth in court. I was no longer the ungrateful daughter who sued her mother, but the one who had dared to stand up for herself. One afternoon, I heard by chance that my mother had moved into a small rented apartment on the edge of town. From the grand villa she once boasted about, she now lived in a cramped room, barely large enough for a bed, a dining table, and a few essentials. I did not go to see her. I no longer felt anger nor expectation. All that remained was one simple truth. This was the consequence of her own choices. Justice had done its part. And as for me, for the first time in my life, I felt no longer bound by my mother's shadow. And that was the greatest victory of all. Chapter 9. Grandma's Letter and the Healing Twist. 3 weeks after the trial, I spent an afternoon sorting through the old boxes Aunt Linda had brought me. They were keepsakes from my grandmother, things I hadn't touched since the day she passed away. Amidst yellowed lace handkerchiefs and a small wooden box, I found an envelope. On it, in the familiar, careful handwriting, were the words, "To my beloved Sarah." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, the handwriting frail but full of warmth. "Sarah, if you are reading this, it means your mother did not return the funds I set aside for you. I knew this could happen, and I am so sorry. But I want you to remember, money is only a part of it. What I truly believe in is the strength within your heart. I want you to use this gift not only for yourself, but for other girls who need a chance to rise as well. You are stronger than you realize, Sarah. I love you endlessly." Tears streamed down my face, blotting the ink. Even after death, my grandmother had seen through the lies and still trusted that I would endure. The letter was like a key unlocking another door, not the door of revenge, but of healing. That evening, I sat for hours by the window, reflecting on everything. I had won in court, regained my dignity and freedom. But the real victory was not watching my mother collapse. It was proving my grandmother right, that I could turn pain into something meaningful. An idea began to form in my mind. Why not transform the restitution money into a scholarship for girls like me? Girls abandoned by their families, cut off from support, but still yearning to study. I could give them what I once lacked, a hand to lift them up. When I shared the idea with Aunt Linda and Tommy, both of them wept. Tommy squeezed my hand and said, "Sarah, this is how it ends. Not just revenge, but a new beginning for yourself and for others." I smiled. Yes. My grandmother's letter was not only a farewell, it was a path out of the darkness, leading me into a new chapter, a chapter of healing, of sharing, and of true strength. Chapter 10. The Ending Scholarships and New Freedom. 6 months after the court's verdict, my life had completely changed. I no longer woke up with fear, no longer haunted by the thought that people might believe my mother's lies. Instead, I opened my eyes in a small house on Elm Street with a backyard garden and the bright roses I tended myself. And by my side was Honey, my loyal golden retriever, a gentle reminder that I was worthy of unconditional love. But what made me proudest was not just the peace I had built for myself. It was the day I stood on stage at the community college auditorium, the very place where I had once taken night classes to patch together my education. This time, I wasn't there to receive a diploma. I was there to give someone else a chance. In front of me stood 5 young women, their eyes both timid and resolute. Each carried her own story, her own scars. One had been cut off by her family for daring to escape an arranged marriage. One worked 2 part-time jobs to raise her younger sibling. Another had been told girls don't need college. They were reflections of who I had once been, alone, doubted, but unyielding. I smiled and my voice rang out steady. Today isn't just about receiving a scholarship. It's about proving that your dreams matter, that no one has the right to extinguish them. My grandmother once left me an inheritance, and though it was stolen, her love and faith in me endured. I want to pass that gift on to you. I watched each face light up as they accepted their scholarship checks. In their eyes, I saw the 18-year-old Sarah I once was, but this time, instead of trembling in the dark, I saw determination and hope. And I understood the cycle had been broken. After the ceremony, I sat alone in the empty hall. Folding chairs clattered as staff cleaned up the fragrance of roses from the stage arrangement still hung in the air. I thought of my grandmother. If she were alive, she would be smiling softly, seeing her granddaughter transform pain into a gift for others. My mother still sent occasional letters, sometimes apologies, sometimes blame, but I had learned not to let them seep into my life anymore. I didn't need her to validate my worth. I had already claimed it myself through the life I was living, through the scholarship in my grandmother's name, through the freedom I had won back. That night back at home, I sat on the porch, watching Honey curl up by my feet, breathing in the sweet scent of roses carried by the wind. For the first time in 20 years, I felt true peace. I whispered in my heart, "I did it, Grandma. I broke free. I turned every wound into strength, and I will keep passing this light to others." To me, that was the truest ending, not only reclaiming justice, but also finding freedom in my soul. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. I was a victor. There was a time I thought my life would always be drowned in lies and pain, but in the end, those very wounds became the foundation for something far more beautiful. I didn't just reclaim my dignity and justice. I found the strength to help others girls who had been abandoned just like me. That is the true victory. Because revenge may bring momentary satisfaction, but only when we turn pain into light for others do we find real freedom. If this story touches your heart, share it so that more women will know they too can rise and reclaim their power.